The pressure drop, the static peak. My name is Calder. I work as a high-altitude meteorological observer on the upper slopes of Mount Rainier. My station is a reinforced steel and glass pod anchored into the volcanic rock at 10,000 feet. It's a job defined by numbers: barometric pressure, wind velocity, and dew point. Most people come to this mountain for the view, but I'm here for the atmosphere, the way the air feels when it's about to break. Isolation is part of the contract. Up here, the wind doesn't just howl, it vibrates. It's a constant, low-frequency hum that settles into your teeth. You learn to live with the silence of the snow, a silence so thick it feels like being buried alive in white velvet. 2 nights ago, the barometers did something I've never seen in 15 years of service. The pressure didn't just drop, it plummeted. The needle on the analog gauge didn't sweep, it slammed into the peg at the bottom of the dial, as if the weight of the entire atmosphere had suddenly vanished. The air inside the pod became thin, sharp, and metallic, tasting like a handful of copper pennies. Then, the static began. It started as a faint crackle on the radio, but within minutes, it was everywhere. Every metal surface in the room began to glow with a faint, ghostly blue light, St. Elmo's fire. Common sack. My hair stood on end, dancing toward the ceiling. The air smelled of ozone and scorched ozone, so thick it made my eyes water. I looked out the reinforced observation window. The sky wasn't dark. It was a bruised, swirling purple, and the clouds weren't moving with the wind. They were circling the peak, tightening like a noose. I grabbed my binoculars and scanned the ridge. That's when I saw the wrong element. About a half-mile away, perched on a jagged outcropping known as the Ghost Crag, was a shape. It was massive, the size of a small private plane, but it wasn't mechanical. It looked like a hunched figure draped in a heavy, feathered cloak, the color of a thundercloud. It didn't move. It just sat there, and with every second that passed, the blue static in my room grew brighter. The blue light began to arc from the control panel to my fingertips, small, painful snaps of electricity that pulsed in a rhythmic sequence. Snap, snap, snap. The sound was coming from the ridge too. Not a bird's cry, a boom. A deep, subterranean thud that shook the mountain to its roots. It sounded like a giant drum made of stretched hide being struck from inside the earth. I adjusted the focus on my binoculars. The creature, the thing, slowly began to unfold. It didn't have a head like an eagle or a hawk. It was a face made of shifting gray smoke, with 2 eyes that were nothing more than blinding white-hot arcs of lightning. And then the radio spoke. The power was off. The wires were fried, but the speaker crackled with a voice that sounded like 1,000 crashing waves. Calder, the sky is empty. We need a new conductor. The steel walls of the observatory began to groan. It wasn't the sound of wind pushing against the structure. It was the sound of the metal being pulled, the blue arcs of St. Elmo's fire were no longer just dancing on the consoles. Mere sparks had grown into thick, jagged ropes of light that tethered me to the equipment. My skin felt tight, buzzing, with a frantic energy that made every nerve ending scream. Outside, the silhouette on Ghost Crag grew. It didn't just stand up, it expanded, its wingspan blotting out the swirling purple of the storm. Each time those wings shifted, a peal of thunder didn't follow it preceded the movement, a preemptive boom that flattened the snow for miles. Calder. The circuit must close. The radio hissed again. The voice was layered, a cacophony of every storm that had ever broken over this peak. I scrambled for the grounding protocols. In a high-altitude storm, your only hope is the copper mesh woven into the concrete floor. I lunged for the emergency grounding strap, a thick lead meant to be clipped to the technician's belt during a lightning strike. But as I reached for the latch, the wrong element shifted into focus. The blue light wasn't just coming from the equipment. It was coming from my own hands. My veins were glowing, a bright, electric violet beneath my skin. I wasn't being hit by the storm. I was becoming a part of it. The creature wasn't attacking the station. It was calling to the electricity it had planted inside me the moment the barometer hit zero. A massive shadow fell over the pod. I looked up. Through the reinforced glass of the skylight, I saw it. It wasn't a bird of flesh and bone. Up close, it was an entity of pure, condensed weather. Its feathers were jagged shards of frozen rain, and its body was a swirling vortex of dark, heavy clouds. It descended. The weight of its presence was crushing. The barometric pressure inside the pod spiked so fast my eardrums shattered with a wet pop. In the sudden, ringing silence, I watched the creature's talons arcs of white-hot plasma wrap around the steel beams of the observatory. The roof didn't blow off. It melted. The reinforced steel curled back like scorched paper, exposing me to the raw, freezing heart of the storm. I lay on the floor, gasping for air that felt like liquid fire, staring up into the eyes of the Thunderbird. They weren't eyes. They were two infinite voids of electrical discharge, showing me a vision of the world before the first man walked a world of constant, cleansing fire. The creature leaned down, its beak, a jagged protrusion of obsidian-colored ice, stopping inches from my chest. You are the anchor. Calder. It vibrated. Hold the sky down. R. Then the first bolt struck, not from the sky to the mountain, but from the creature directly into my heart. The world became a sequence of flashes. White, violet, black. Each bolt that surged through me didn't feel like a burn. It felt like an expansion. My thoughts were no longer my own. They were replaced by the frantic, ancient data of the mountain. I could feel the temperature of the tectonic plates shifts miles below, and the moisture content of every cloud for 100 miles in the Puget Sound. I was no longer a man in a pod. I was a component, a biological fuse in a system that had been dormant for 1,000 years. The Thunderbird didn't move. It remained perched on the ruins of my station, its wings spread wide to catch the ascending currents. It was a massive, living antenna, and I was the grounding wire. The others are sleeping. Calder. The collective voice boomed inside the fluid of my brain. Wake them with the bone hum. I looked out through the jagged, melted remains of the observatory walls. Below me, in the valleys and the small towns surrounding the mountain, the lights were going out. One by one, the grid was failing. Not because of a power surge, but because the energy was being pulled back. The Thunderbird was reclaiming the electricity, drawing it up the slopes and into the station. I could see the blue lines of power crawling along the power lines like glowing snakes, all converging on my position. I tried to move my fingers, but they were fused to the copper mesh of the floor. My skin was no longer translucent. It had turned the color of ash, scarred with branching patterns, Lichtenberg figures that glowed with a permanent, internal white light. Then, the second wrong element appeared. In the valley below, other shapes began to rise. They weren't birds. They were pillars of dust, vortices of snow, and shadows that moved against the wind. The Thunderbird wasn't alone. It was the vanguard. I reached for the emergency radio transmitter, the old battery-op unit that was shielded in lead. My hand moved with a jerky, mechanical hitch, my joints snapping like dry wood. I managed to flip the switch. "Mayday," I whispered. My voice didn't sound like a human's. It sounded like the crackle of a downed power line. Station 14. The atmospheric breach is total. Do not send rescue. Ground the mountain. Ground it all. The Thunderbird looked down at me. It didn't have a mouth to smile, but the intensity of the light in its eyes increased. It raised one wing, and the air around us shattered. The sound wasn't thunder anymore. It was the sound of the sky being torn open like silk. Through the rift, I didn't see space. I saw the true sky, a churning ocean of electrical fire, where things much larger than the Thunderbird were circling, waiting for the bridge to be completed. And I was the bridge. The rift in the sky didn't close. It expanded until the peak of Mount Rainier was no longer part of Washington state, but a jagged island floating in an ocean of violet electricity. I felt my physical form beginning to fray at the edges, my atoms vibrating at a frequency that the human body was never meant to sustain. I wasn't dying. I was being translated into a different language, one written in voltage and thunder. The Thunderbird let out a final, resonant boom that shattered the last of the observatory's glass into fine, white powder. It spread its wings, and for a heartbeat, I wasn't looking at a creature. I was looking at the blueprint of the world's first storm. The circuit is complete. Calder, you are the memory of the rain. Then the world went white. Not the white of snow, but the absolute blinding white of a short-circuiting sun. 6 weeks later, a recovery team from the National Weather Service finally reached the summit. The ascent had been delayed by unprecedented atmospheric disturbances that had grounded every chopper for 100 miles. They didn't find the observatory, where the reinforced steel pod should have been. There was only a circular patch of vitrified rock glass formed from the volcanic sand, fused together by a heat more intense than a lightning strike. There were no scraps of metal, no wires, and no trace of me. But as the team lead stepped onto the glass floor, his Geiger counter didn't click. His radio did. The unit was switched off, the batteries removed for the climb. Yet, a clear, crisp signal began to broadcast from the speaker. It wasn't a voice. It was the sound of a barometer needle hitting a peg. Clink, clink, clink. And then, a whisper. It sounded like Calder, but it was layered with the sound of 1,000 crashing waves and the hum of a downed power line. The pressure is still dropping. Don't look at the clouds. The team lead looked up. The sky was perfectly clear, a brilliant, mocking blue. But as he watched, a single, bruised, purple cloud began to form directly over the peak. It didn't move with the wind. It circled, tightening like a noose, while the air around the men began to smell sharply of ozone and scorched copper. On the glass floor, right where I had been standing, a series of permanent Lichtenberg figures began to glow with a faint, violet light. They weren't just scars in the rock, they were coordinates. The Thunderbird hadn't left. It had just moved the station into the ghost frequency, and it was waiting for the next technician to come up and check the numbers. I'm still here. I'm the static on your radio. I'm the hair standing up on your arms before the strike. I'm the pressure you feel in your chest when the sky turns that specific bruised shade of purple. The sky is never empty. It's just waiting for a new conductor.